all my esteemed friends, Honorable Justice Sikri, Professor Upen Bakshi, my friend Salman, Lokendra Malik, Yogesh Pratap Singh, Professor Ranbir Singh, everybody. Seeing the list of names, I was reminded of the phrase, the list of names in today's function. I was reminded of the phrase, the usual suspects, because, because I say so also because a very similar combination of us spoke at another fetch script for the same man, Upendra Bakshi, in February of this year. Of course, at the rate at which Professor Bakshi is collecting fetch scripts, he is soon going to establish a record. This is not formally a fetch script, it's a dedicated book, but I count it in his long and seemingly endless list of fetch scripts by admirers, by students, by friends. Let me therefore start by quoting a few lines I said about Professor Upen Bakshi at that fetch script in February this year. And I said, among other things, that I always thought to myself that Professor Bakshi was born to be not only a professor and professorial in looks, mannerisms, style, dress, and so on, but his lock of somewhat unruly hair, and I find that that is very well preserved, orderly, unruly hair, even today, his archetypal pipe, which I find missing, but his slow and measured drawl, his muffler, a little early in the weather for that, all reminiscent to me as a younger man of the quintessential academic. And as I said that day, for a while I suspected him of corrupting my father into pipe smoking. But so wonderful was the aroma of that rich brand of tobacco that I can confess, and so hypnotic was the sight of cleaning it, like a Japanese tea ceremony, a catharsis in itself, that I must confess that I almost started pipe smoking. But uh, Dr. Bakshi has always been a great thinker, a very creative brain, and you can see that he has lost none of that creativity. In the L.M. Singh Memorial Lecture, he used this beautiful alliterative trilogy of, of jurisprudence, and demosprudence, and then went on to expound it in very, very interesting terms. Well, friends, and I'm not in Delhi, so I've had only a limited time to see a PDF copy of the book. But as I turned to the table of contents, what struck me was the very interesting, the very innovative, bold, candid, and catchy use of the titles in the table of contents. In particular, what caught my eye was serial number 5, post-retirement, judges issues. 6, lordship versus ladyship, gender diversity. 8, administrative issues with the CJI as the master of that particular set of issues. 10, curative rule or ruse. 12, what I've called an unruly horse for a long time, they call it the PIL, pill for every ill. Then the CJI in 14 as the master of all conventions. And then 15, the Prashant Bhushan case, very nicely described as response to a tweet by a 108-page judgment. Some of these, of course, may not be classed as scholarly law school curricula items or subjects. But that is precisely why they are both important and interesting. Because what they do not teach you at Delhi Indian universities is sometimes the more important part of the legal system and not merely of law. So let me address some of these elephants in the room, which my careful, cautious, and wise co-panelists have perhaps deliberately avoided doing. Um, the first is the issue of post-retirement employment of judges. I do sincerely believe that it must be controlled in some way. I have no clear answers, frankly, but I'm certain that the present system is most unsatisfactory. It, first of all, appears to have no methodical, systematic methods of selecting the vast numbers of our judges retiring, and I'm not talking of Supreme Court alone, but also of the high courts. Seems to be based very much on a pick and choose system, an approach Chief Justice of that institution, be it the High Court or the Supreme Court. It is not based either on seniority or on expertise or on aptitude for a particular tribunal for which that selection is being made. And though nominally it is done by committees headed by the Chief Justice or his nominee, and I would imagine, and probably Justice Sikri would know better, 99% of them have Chief Justice nominees. The Chief Justice rarely sits on the actual committee. Selection is very heavily controlled by bureaucrats and influenced by the executive, even though nominally a judge is heading it. So here there is a legitimation function being performed almost inadvertently, because the judiciary lends its approval stamp and yet the executive has its way in many cases, which is obviously the best of both the worlds for the executive. Personally, I think the other oddity in our system would also tackle this issue of post-retirement tribunal appointments, etc., to some extent, possibly to a large extent. When I was chairman for some years of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law, we had written the first report saying that this very strange anachronism of the 62 to 65 arbitrage in age between Supreme Court and High Court judges should be done away with. And it arises from some old myth, a complete illogical kind of approach that you must tie it to some retirement ages of the bureaucracy or sections of other services, which is not at all the case with the judiciary, which is a separate organ. It's interesting that my report is now about, I think, if I remember, at least 8 years or more old. And there have been reports earlier. I was chairman of this committee 8 years ago, the Parliamentary Standing Committee. But this arbitrage, this hiatus continues. It has continued for decades. It is treated as a hierarchy differentiating system, as if 65 retirement makes the 65 retiree superior to the 62 retiree. So that when we send this for inviting responses, we found that yes, some responses said, yes, please do increase everybody to 65, but then make the Supreme Court judge 67. Now, the purpose of this is that a lot of people look for these post-retirement sinecures, sometimes inappropriately, because you are retiring a batch of very high Superior Court judges, after all 226 in many ways vast power, at an age which is completely inappropriate, leading to a lot of unsavory practices, and I don't want to repeat them, which every judge knows about. Justice Sikri surely knows about them. A lot of the unsavory practices happening by claimants to this kind of a lobbying between the 62 and 65 age. So this is something I am still surprised as to why it persists. And I think it's time where we just simply did it without keeping this distinction and stop consulting. The other thing which I want to talk about very briefly before I end is a subject not found in this book. Perhaps it should have addressed, partly statistically and partly qualitatively, the issue of administration of justice, especially in the Supreme Court and High Court, and also in the lower courts during COVID times, whether what we are doing for the last 6-7 months is right, and what is the roadmap for the future. My own view on this is that our existing virtual facilities must be ramped up considerably. And this is a ramping up required in the quality of the software. It is a ramping required in the quantitative load which it can bear. And I'm now talking from the practitioner's viewpoint, what one would not find written about otherwise. To give you 2 examples, you find a bewildering, almost amazing diversity of software in the 20-25 high courts. I myself use at least 10 softwares in 10 different high courts, from BlueJeans to Jitsi to, of course, WebEx, to so many others, including the Delhi High Court as one of the best ones. I have yet not understood why the best of them, which I think is the High Court of Delhi's one, is used across the board. We've had, for example, recently appearing in the Telangana High Court for the Amravati capital city trifurcation matter. And these systems work the worst when there are batch matters. They just cannot accommodate and handle batch matters. The whole system crashed innumerable times, so much so that the hearing has been delayed now for 2 months and is now probably going to be only physically, which excludes many of us. These are varying qualities from Allahabad High Court to Jaipur High Court, from Odisha High Court to Bombay High Court, and I've yet not understood why a module and a protocol for this is not set up. Secondly, I think we have functioned, despite all the self-congratulatory pats on the back, which every court tends to give itself, despite all the press releases we read about what a great number of cases are being dealt with. We have functioned at best in less than 50% of our capacity, whether it be the Supreme Court or it be the High Court. It's only recently, last week, that for a particular week, all the full strength was functioning. But I think that was certainly not the paradigm for all these months. And that is not the paradigm which has been designed to be able to be conducted. When you go down to the lower courts, it is much worse. The lower courts, including courts in Delhi, so within Delhi, within a state and interstate, you have great variations. A Patiala House courts functioning on the COVID platform may be very different from a Saket courts or a Tisarari court. I'm talking of actual experiential issues. And when the numbers are slightly larger, I find systems crashing. I also believe that had virtual courts been properly thought of in these times of crisis, there is no reason why each court would not have 3 or 4 tracks or 2 or 3 tracks devoted only to old final hearing matters. The truth of the matter is that during COVID times, filings have lessened, load has lessened. And this was the time when virtually you ought to have kept 2 tracks of judges, at least in each court, attacking the 10-year-old matters, the 20-year-old matters. Yes, it would be resisted by the bar for a while. Yes, you'd have to give 1 or 2 warnings. But the third warning would say that if you do not attend to these old cases, we will decide anyway. And you'll have people turning up. Now, this could have been done very well in the last 6-7 months. It has not been done. I personally believe that we should continue with at least a 33% paradigm of virtual hearings even after this pandemic scourge is over. Virtual hearing is actually a very effective, very efficacious, in many ways much more efficient. And while physical is being demanded from diverse quarters, even when times are normal, I don't see any reason why you cannot have exclusive tracks put down for virtual hearing, and there will be a large class of people who would be happy to work on that track. I don't see much thinking along those lines. One myth was startlingly exploded recently when, on the basis of huge outcries from several quarters, physicals were started for 3 courts or 4 courts of the Supreme Court, and indeed for some courts of the High Court, Delhi High Court. Why I say that one myth was exploded is because the actual attendance and the demand for such physical courts was counted as less than 1% of the entire class of lawyers who were supposed to be appearing. So I think it is wrong to suppose that lawyers are clamoring in large numbers for physical. Lawyers also want safety and convenience. Yes, there are problems of logistics. There are classes of lawyers who need assistance, but that can easily be managed by providing for a small window of those who must do physical because they don't have the facilities. But to suggest that the whole country is overwhelmingly wanting a physical hearing at the exclusion of virtual hearings is wrong. My last point is about that chapter titled The Response of a 108-Page Judgment to a Tweet. The contempt set, and I have not read the full news, the contempt issue in that case, I think, left much to be desired. And I am not speaking on the merits at whether you think that the accused was wrong or that the court was wrong, that doesn't matter. I think the methodology, the approach in that court was a huge casualty. it in fact diluted the efficacy of the very power, namely the contempt power, which the court was seeking to uphold. The manner of picking up a tweet case with another old case and putting them up together raised a lot of questions. The manner of doing so when it was known that the tenure of one of the judges on the bench was ending very shortly was the second wrong. The manner of adding yet a third case to that batch, which was even older, compounded, I think, and ultimately that third case was left undone. And I think the accused, in fact, was allowed to dare and to utilize a dare, and in fact, somewhat in the dare he gave, because ultimately the sentencing allowed him to claim martyrhood. So I think these are all lessons to be learned about contempt jurisdictions as well. And I think that treatment of the subject also is very useful. May I end, friends, by saying that one would wish Godspeed to all the stakeholders of this book, and of course, to the person to whom it is dedicated, as also the editors, and in particular to Mr. Lokendra Malik, who is the midwife for so many good causes. And I would end with the fond hope that the Supreme Court should look into, should dwell upon and reflect upon books like these. They are not meant to be carping criticism. They are not meant to be negativism. If you dwell and reflect and partly some of the suggestions in the different various issues or administration of justice found in the book, you will only improve the justice delivery system, which is the object, obviously, of all the stakeholders in this system. Thank you very much indeed.